oversight. So, led largely by the Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, a lot of Harding's administration took advantage of the fact and was basically looting the government. Harding becomes aware of the heavy corruption, and one night he was talking to a friend of his, journalist William Allen White. They were walking through the White House. And Harding turned to White and said, "My God, this is a hell of a job." And by the way, I'm pretty sure every president has said that at least once, for some reason. "My God, this is a hell of a job. I have no trouble with my enemies, but my friends, my goddamn friends. They're the ones that keep me walking the floor at night." So Harding was aware of what was going on. And very soon, so was the American public. On the 14th of April, 1922, a story breaks in the Wall Street Journal. It was an expose about, good morning, talking about the corruption in the Harding administration, the scandals. The article in the Wall Street Journal detailed kickback payments to high government officials. They were from an oil company called Sinclair Oil. And apparently, they were getting unbelievably favorable leases on a naval oil reserve. It was called the Teapot Dome. And very fittingly, this becomes known as the Teapot Dome scandal. You know why they called it the Teapot Dome? That one's actually kind of a gimme. They called it that because it looked like a teapot. That's sort of who's buried in Grant's tomb question. If you ever saw a picture of it, it sort of looks like a teapot. The Teapot Dome was an oil reserve in Wyoming, and Congress decides to investigate. Harding decides to get out of Washington before the hearings start. So he goes on a speaking tour of the nation. Now, he had a bad heart, and he fell ill while he was in Alaska. But he decided to continue the trip. He goes on to California, and on the 2nd of August, 1923, he was scheduled to give a speech in San Francisco. He never gives a speech. He died. Probably from a heart attack. We don't know, because Mrs. Harding would not allow an autopsy. Can you imagine that today? A sitting president dying and they don't have an autopsy? Bless you. This led to speculation that she had poisoned him, that she had found out about the mistresses. Well, the fact of the matter is she always did know about them. That was nothing new. And there's no evidence she poisoned him. She died a year later, by the way. So, Harding passes away in office. Doesn't mean that the investigations go away. And they found numerous cases of corruption, and they led to several high-profile trials and convictions. The biggest one was the Teapot Dome scandal. Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, was convicted and spent a year in prison and fined $10,000. which was a lot of money back then. He is the first cabinet member in American history to be convicted and sent to jail. Not the first one to deserve it, but the first one to get caught and sent to jail. By the way, you know what he was using most of the money for? The bribe money he was getting? You ever hear of Pat Garrett? You know who he was? Yeah, way to go. He's the guy that killed Billy the Kid. He was a sheriff in New Mexico. No, that was true. It's true. But Fall had bought Garrett's ranch after Garrett died, and he was using the money to expand it, to build it up. So we know what he was using the bribe money for. But he's the highest official convicted and sent to jail for these scandals. He wasn't alone, though. Several high-profile government officials were found guilty of crimes. Charles Forbes, head of the Veterans Bureau. He had also been the man in charge of overseeing the construction of the brand new naval base at Pearl Harbor. He was convicted on fraud and bribery charges and did time in Leavenworth. Thomas Miller, custodian for the Alien Property Bureau, was convicted and sent to jail. And two other government officials, Assistant Attorney General Jess Smith and a presidential aide, Charles Kramer, both committed suicide, probably to avoid prosecution. What's the one name I haven't mentioned in here? Yeah, he gets off. They try him twice on bribery charges, and he beats the rap both times. So the guy that's considered the ringleader of this corrupt Ohio gang under Harding never spends a day in jail. Now, upon Harding's death, Calvin Coolidge inherits the White House. Coolidge, to be honest, was a non-entity. He really didn't do a hell of a lot as president. But on the other hand, he does help restore confidence and dignity to the presidency after all the scandals in the Harding administration. Coolidge was honest, a little naive. When Herbert Hoover and Charles Evans Hughes, two of the non-corrupt members of the cabinet, approached him to tell him that Daugherty and the others, good morning, were corrupt, he didn't believe it at first. He couldn't believe that a gentleman could be corrupt. So he was kind of naive. Here's Albert Wall, right? Unlike Harding, he didn't drink, he didn't curse, and he was a devoted father and family man. Devoted to his wife. And surprisingly, here's a picture of Harding. Surprisingly, he was married to a former beauty queen. And I always wondered why, because it's not like he offset his bland looks with charisma or anything.
I said, he's a handsome fellow. What's wrong with him?
I don't know. He's not my type, I guess. But if you ever saw a picture of Mrs. Coolidge, you know, it's kind of, doesn't seem to go together for me anyway. Anyway, he was a devoted husband and father. He loved animals. They had dozens of pets in the White House. Dogs, cats, they had a raccoon, you name it. They had all sorts of animals running around. He, unlike most politicians, he did not like giving speeches or attending public events. Have you folks ever been to a political rally of any kind? Who have you seen? Mitt Romney? Okay. Anybody else?
I went to the Republican convention this last night.
Oh, that must have been really cool.
Yeah, I was an intern for Ralph Portman, so.
Oh, okay. They love the limelight, don't they? Politicians. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of them feed on it. Coolidge was the opposite. He didn't like it at all. Like I said, he didn't like attending public events. One person asked him why he bothered to go to dinner parties. And he said, well, a man's got to eat supper somewhere. He was notoriously taciturn. You know what I mean by that? He didn't like to speak very much. Very quiet. He was at a dinner party, an official function, and he had heard ahead of time that the socialite sitting next to him had a bet with a friend that she could get him to say more than 3 words in a row. And all night long, she's trying to engage him in conversation. And all he would do, all he would respond in his high-pitched New England twang, he would, yes, no. Finally, at 5 minutes till midnight, he turned to her and said, you lose. So he had a bit of a sense of humor. As I pointed out, he doesn't really do much as president, but then again, he wasn't asked to do a lot, and never said he would. Someone asked him what he was going to do as president. He replied, as little as possible. And as far as I know, he's the only president to keep his campaigns pledged. He really didn't do a hell of a lot. He believed that, quote, the business of America is business. And he should interfere as little as possible. He's not exactly Roosevelt or Wilson, is he? He is not an activist president. Coolidge is a throwback to an earlier age of the limited presidency. Hoover, his successor, will also be. And then you get FDR, who will revive the activist presidency. And by the way, Coolidge was totally acceptable to the American public. They didn't want anybody rocking the boat. So when he runs in his own stead in 1924, he's overwhelmingly elected. So he's going to be, ironically, the rather naive Puritan Coolidge will be president during the so-called Roaring Twenties. Now, the 20s were generally a very prosperous era. Not everybody prospers. If you're urban, if you're middle class, if you're upper working class, you prosper during the 20s. If you tend to live in a small town in a rural area, if you're a farmer, if you're a minority, you don't prosper. You're left out. So a lot of people do get ahead in the 20s, others don't. Now, there are several things driving the prosperity. One of them was World War I. The war had killed the economies of our major competitors, Germany, England, France. So for several years, we really didn't have much competition in a world market. You see that big time after World War II. We had basically a 20-year stretch after World War II where we had little global competition. After World War I, it's not that lengthy of a period. but it's still enough to get us through the 20s with a lot of prosperity. Secondly, the prosperity is driven by technology. This is an era of a lot of new technologies, and we will look at them in a little bit. What are the new technologies? Just briefly, yeah.
The automobile?
There you go, the automobile.
Vacuum.
The vacuum. Consumer products in general, yeah. Not just vacuum cleaners, but washing machines and things like that. Remember, you used to have to do a lot of that stuff by hand. What else?
Machine gun? There, that machine gun? Machine
No, those were, are you talking about submachine guns like,
gun? Fully automatic. Machine gun.
like a Thompson or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know if they were using them. Were they using them before World War I?
They were actually invented. Thompson invented it during World War I, and the U.S. Army started issuing it in the very last days of the war, but it never saw service.
Just using the binder.
Well, they didn't, until then, they didn't actually have any handheld submachine guns. You know, all the machine guns were those big bulky things I showed you. Radio is going to be another technology that's going to drive the 20s. And the rise of the movie industry. So there are a lot of factors that are going to go into making the prosperity of the 1920s. Now, one of the things the 20s is most noted for is the so-called noble experiment, prohibition. Remember, the 18th Amendment had been ratified. The amendment itself simply outlaws alcohol, but Congress has to pass legislation to enable it. They have to pass an enabling act to be able to enforce it. That's known as the Volstead Act, after its sponsor. Good morning. So when the nation goes dry, officially anyway, on the 16th of January, 1920, up till midnight that night, you could have had a legal drink. What does prohibition actually outlaw? What does the Volstead Act prohibit? Yeah,
Isn't it the manufacturing, selling, and transport?
thank you, yeah. You're not allowed to manufacture alcohol, transport it, or sell it. So if you have some sitting around the house, can you drink that?
Yes.
Yeah, that's perfectly legal. You can't take it to your neighbor's house and drink it anymore, but if you got it sitting there, you can drink it in your own house. So it doesn't actually prohibit drinking, it prohibits the manufacture, sale, and transportation. Now, Prohibition was a culmination of a movement that predated the Civil War. By 1914, 14 states were already, quote, dry. That was a term for it. And 3/4 of the country before 1918. So much of the nation was already dry before we had Prohibition. Much like in many areas of the country, women could vote before we had women's suffrage. There's a definite split on who supports Prohibition and who doesn't it. In almost every state where it passed, it was the rural counties that passed it. The farm counties. It fails in almost every big city. When you look at the vote on Patty, it's sake. Same thing in New York, same thing in Chicago. So rural America forces this on urban America. And a lot of people just aren't going to go along with it. They were naive enough to believe when they passed Prohibition that if you outlaw alcohol everybody will stop drinking. Like I said, obviously, that was extremely naive. All it did is drive it underground. By the way, people did drink less during Prohibition. You know why? Had little to do with the fact that the government said you weren't supposed to do it. Why did people drink less during Prohibition? Thank you. You're 2 for 2, man. Well, 2.5 to vacuum cleaner. And you were on the right track with that, too. Yeah, it's more expensive. A drink of whiskey, a shot of whiskey before Prohibition cost $0.25 in a bar. Yeah, you could blitz on $5, couldn't you? Huh?
Yeah.
Probably not a good idea, but you could do it. Yeah. During Prohibition, that same drink that cost you $0.25 before Prohibition now costs you $2.50. The price of alcohol spirals upwards, about 10 times more during Prohibition than before. And to make matters worse, by the way, the quality goes way down for a bunch of reasons.
And they make that stuff with bathtubs, really? They really make that stuff?
Yeah. People actually,
Tough?
yeah, that's one reason it was difficult to enforce. There's no secret ingredient that goes into alcohol, is there? You can buy everything you need to make alcohol, basically, at Kroger's. They used to sell during Prohibition wine and beer making kits. The wine kits they called grape juice kits. And they sold everything you needed to make wine except yeast. That kept it legal. So you go to the store, you plop down a nickel, you buy a thing of yeast, and go home and make wine. Both my German-American grandfathers brewed beer at home. Not that hard to do. I got friends here on the faculty that brew beer. Quite good beer, actually. One makes a great limoncello, too, but that's another issue. So, one, it's easily obtainable. You can prohibit something, but when you make it at home, it's hard to enforce. Secondly, people are still smuggling it in. You have Canada, Mexico, Cuba. They still all drink. Take a, I don't have, well, here's one. But you look at the American coastline, look at that. How the hell are you going to patrol that? Thousands and thousands of miles of little inlets and bays and coves and all that. It's a smuggler's paradise. Cuba's what, 90 miles off the coast. Here's the Bahamas. Quick trip from Miami, you can get rich. So smuggling it in isn't that difficult, especially when the local police are conniving in it. And that was usually the case. Here's dumping illegal beer after a speakeasy raid. And by the way, those were rare. Most of them were for show. Very few speakeasies were ever raided. Most big city police departments were corrupted. That's one of the drawbacks with Prohibition. The gangsters could offer these guys huge bribes just to look the other way. You know, what's wrong with somebody having a beer, right? So it led to the wholesale corruption of urban police departments. And it also kind of changed the mindset in the American public. During Prohibition, the majority of Americans routinely broke the law. And that's a bad precedent to set. Like I said, they were naive and thought people would just quit drinking. So they didn't really have strong ideas about enforcement. The so-called Prohibition Bureau, the federal enforcement agency for prohibition, had only 2,836 agents for the entire nation. One of the leading bootleggers, Al Capone, in Chicago, had 1,000 employees alone. Now, granted, he's one of the larger bootleggers, but his operation alone was too big for the Prohibition Bureau to really deal with, let alone the rest of the country. Capone's typical of the fact that prohibition also leads to the rise of organized crime. Organized crime is nothing new. I got it, went back to ancient Roman times as far as we know. And there were gangs in American cities before Prohibition. But they tended to be ethnic and they tended to operate solely in their own neighborhoods. You had Irish gangs that operated in the Irish neighborhoods, like Five Points in New York, for example, or Jewish gangs, or the Mafia, which operated largely only in Italian or Sicilian neighborhoods. Well, Prohibition allows them to go national. It gives them a product they can deliver that most people want, and they don't mind dealing with gangsters to get it. So this is going to make organized crime in America a national phenomenon and a very wealthy one. And it also leads to a rise of violence in the cities, as these gangs fight over territory, much like modern drug gangs do. In fact, they're the ones that invented the drive-by. They're the first generation that had both the automobile and a machine gun. As I pointed out, Thompsons were invented right before the 20s. You know how the gangsters found out about them, by the way? Weirdest connection in the world. You know what a dude ranch is? It's a...
Alright, go ahead. There was a show called Dude, Bar None Dude Ranch. It was a really stupid show in the 80s. I swear, but I had no idea what the significance of a dude ranch was.
Oh, they were very popular.
They were just hanging out.
When we yeah, basically, city people would go to these fancy ranches and play cowboy, you know. And that's where the gangsters actually learned about Thompsons. After the war, there wasn't a market for them. And the manufacturers started selling them to farmers out west to shoot coyotes and things like that. And when the gangsters would go out west, like to Colorado, they had a couple of dude ranches out there that were the favorites of gangsters. That's where they discovered Thompson submachine guns. How's that for a weird connection? Brought them back to Chicago, and the rest is history, unfortunately. So, if you wanted to get a drink during Prohibition, where did you go to get one? Yeah. Thank you. An illegal bar known as a speakeasy. Technically, you had to have a code to get in. Make sure you weren't, a government agent or something, but many of them were wide open, and they were all over the place. In New York City, there were 30,000 known speakeasies. Cincinnati had a few thousand. Most of them operated very openly, and some of them catered to very specific clientele. Chumley's Tea House in New York, for example, catered to the radical left. The 21 Club served the elite of New York. including the mayor, Jimmy Walker. He had his own private booth at the 21 Club. They had a private room known as the wine room. That's the mayor of New York, and he has his own private booth in a speakeasy. What does that tell you about enforcement? Probably the most notorious of the bootleggers, I already mentioned, Alfonso Capone. Al Capone. Came to America as a child from Sicily, grew up in New York, made the mistake of crossing the Irish mob in New York. That's how he got his famous scar on his face, from an Irish mobster. That's how he became known as Scarface. Basically, so he could stay alive, his buddies got him out of New York and shipped him off to Chicago. And he got involved there in organized crime, rose to the top, and became the most notorious gangster in America. A lot of people had no idea just how evil he was. He hobnobbed with movie stars, with politicians. He was seen as a philanthropist. During the Depression, he opened up soup kitchens to feed the poor. But it was all a facade. He was ruthless, he was homicidal, he was a bit of a psycho, quite frankly. After a while, because of the drive-bys, the intense murders going on and all that, the image of these guys being some sort of romantic figure begins to unravel. And the event that brings a lot of it down happens on Valentine's Day in 1929, 14th of February. The Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 men, 5 of them members of the rival Northside Gang, were gunned down by Capone's men dressed as police. And though no one was convicted for it, we know who the shooters were. They brought several guys in from the Detroit mob to do the job. They did the shooting, and they got back on the train and went back to Detroit. 2 of the victims were rather innocent. One was a mechanic who worked at the garage, had nothing to do with it, and the other was a doctor whose only crime was he liked hanging out with gangsters. This is what really turns the public against the gangsters. As I pointed out, no one was ever convicted, but it's widely assumed, in fact, it's pretty well known, that Capone ordered the hit. So with this new public outrage, the government's going to go after the gangsters, particularly Capone. And yes, Chicago did form a new police unit called the Untouchables, because they were uncorruptible. But they're not the ones that nailed Capone and most of the other gangsters. It's the scariest organization in the U.S. government that nailed them. The IRS. Wasn't the FBI, wasn't the Untouchables, it was the IRS. They found a flaw in the gangsters' armor. These guys are filthy rich, and most of them don't have a living. Capone technically was an importer of olive oil. So they basically audited him and found out that he was living in a lifestyle far above his declared income. So they actually nailed most of the gangsters on tax evasion. That's how they got Capone. He will serve 7 years in the 1930s, from 1932 to 1939, in one of the most notorious prisons in America. Where does he serve his time? Yeah, thank you, Alcatraz. Any folks ever been out to San Francisco? Did you ever visit the island?
Oh,
Yeah, kind of neat, isn't it?
yeah.
Mhm. Can you see why nobody ever escaped?
There are questions that one person might have.
That's true, Clint Eastwood might have made it.
But yeah, no, that would be, you would just drown.
Yeah, the character he played in the movie might have made it.
Yeah.
Frank, what's his name or whatever. In fact, there's pretty good evidence now that he
Yeah.
did.
There were sightings, so.
Yeah. But anybody else have been out there? Yeah, you gotta get out there, it's pretty neat. But you get to tour it and all that, you can see where all the bad guys were kept and stuff like that. You understand why it was considered a hellhole, if you ever, yeah. Mhm. Nice ride out though on the boat. Capone, he contracted syphilis earlier in his life because one of his earlier jobs was running a set of whorehouses for the Chicago mob. And it developed when he was in prison. He got out of prison a broken man. He was a vegetable by the time he got out of jail. And he'll die in 1947. Cincinnati had its own notorious bootlegger. One of the most famous in the country. Anybody know who it was? He's the guy that actually inspired The Great Gatsby. You ever read that? This is Cincinnati's own notorious bootlegger, George Remus. God, he was famous back then. He was famous because he wasn't, unlike Capone, he wasn't violent or anything. He was really smart. You know, you could buy alcohol legally back then. But you know what you needed for it? A doctor's prescription. Yes, your doctor could prescribe alcohol to you. So they were still legally manufacturing it. Remus was both a lawyer and a licensed pharmacist. Yeah, the guy was corrupt, but he was really smart. He figured out that if he bought up the licenses to produce legal alcohol, he could produce a lot of illegal alcohol with the refineries, especially at night. So his big thing, his contribution to prohibition, basically, he supplied a lot of the other bootleggers. He also knew Capone quite well. He used to be his lawyer. But Remus had a lavish lifestyle, had a huge mansion up in Price Hill. Any folks from the west side, you familiar with Elder High School over there? You know the big gates out in front of Elder? Those used to be in front of Remus's mansion in Price Hill. Yeah, strange, isn't it? They're nice gates. But he was married to a former dancer, burlesque queen and all that. They threw lavish parties. On one New Year's at midnight, he presented all the men at the party with a brand new car and all the women with diamond-studded watches. It just happened to be the mayor, the police chief. He had the city in his pocket. He eventually got busted by the IRS. And that's even a freakier story. The IRS agent fell in love with his wife and they started having an affair. And she decided to betray him so they could take over the business. So he ends up getting convicted of tax evasion, gets out of jail, ends up, when by that point the wife and the IRS agent had split up, but the day they were supposed to get a divorce, he shot her dead in Eden Park.
chased her down in front of several witnesses and shot her dead. Then he gets himself off by claiming insanity. This is a pretty good lawyer, actually. Except the judge got the last laugh. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, so the judge committed him to an asylum for several years. And when he finally got out, his business was ruined. He died in obscurity. But since then, he had one of the most famous bootleggers of all. As I pointed out, that's the story that inspired Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. Now, Prohibition is in many ways the colorful side of the 20s. And as I pointed out, a lot of the prosperity is being driven more by technology. And one of the inventions, there are two in the 20s that revolutionized America. One of them is radio. Now, in today's world, with the internet and texting and television and satellite communications, doesn't sound like that big of a deal. Keep in mind, it was the first mass medium ever. It was the first time you could actually link the nation, East Coast and West Coast, simultaneously. It's a revolution, folks. Now, radio predated World War I by many years, but it wasn't until the 1920s that it becomes commercially popular. In September of 1920, American stores start selling a radio made by Westinghouse that cost only $10. And it's still a lot of money back then, but it's affordable to the average middle-class family now. And just a few months later, regular radio broadcasts begin in many cities. There have been experimental radio stations all through the teens and early 20s. Beginning in 1920, they're going to go on the air full time. Probably the first full-time radio station in America was in Pittsburgh, KDKA. Most historians consider that to be the first one. By the way, they debut on the 2nd of November, 1920. And what's the first thing they broadcast? I'll give you a hint. November 2nd, 1920 was a Tuesday. No, a rerun of NCIS. November 2nd, Tuesday? The presidential election that year. That was the first thing they broadcast. About a year and a half later, in 1922, WLW in Cincinnati begins broadcasting. And they built one of the most powerful radio stations in the world. Yeah. They were the first station in Cincinnati and one of the first in the entire country. They had a 55,000 watt transmitter. You could hear them out in California. It was so powerful people could pick it up on metal fences. Kind of hard to tune in on a metal fence. I'm not kidding. Under the right atmospheric conditions, you could pick it up on a fence. It was so powerful. And like I said, you could hear it clearly out in Los Angeles. They had to eventually tone it down because it was causing interference with a lot of other stations around the country. But for a long time, it was a national radio station. 1922, there's only about 60,000 radios in use. By the end of the decade, there are over 10 million radios in use. And that number will skyrocket even more in the 1940s. Radio, along with the movies, will impact American culture in many ways. It impacts the way we talk. Before radio and movies, regional accents were far more pronounced. Well, when they started going on the air, and they had the same problem in England with the BBC, they were trying to look for an accent that everybody could understand and didn't sound too regional. In BBC, they settled on what is called in England public school English, basically upper middle class, that London educated English. What do we settle on here,
The transatlantic.
please?
The transatlantic.
Yep, more specifically though. You're on the right track.
It's the Judy Garland sounding voice.
Yeah, the Midwestern accent.
It's kind of different from that, isn't
Yeah,
it?
a little different, but that's what they based it on. They started looking for announcers that had that broad, more Midwestern accent. I don't mean like Minnesota where they talk through their nose, anything like that. I mean here, like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, the heartland. They didn't want anybody that had a deep Southern accent or that New England, nasal twang or whatever. So they basically settled on the broad Midwestern accent. That's why a lot of people on the radio sound like us. It's going to have a huge impact on American sports, especially baseball. Back then, there were only 16 teams. And they weren't paying Manny Machado $300 million for 10 years. That's another issue. The highest paid player, by the way, in the 20s, guess who it was in the 20s?
Babe Ruth.
Yeah. You know what he made his best year?
I know he made more than the president or something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, he made $100,000 a year. And somebody said, "You make more than the president." He replied,
Every year.
"I had a better year than the president." That was it during the Depression. Yeah. But, yeah, baseball had been popular largely as a participatory sport, playing. There were only 16 major league teams, 8 in the National League, 8 in the American League, and they were all in the East. There wasn't a baseball team west of St. Louis or south of Cincinnati. So a lot of people around the country never got to see a Major League Baseball game. Well, a lot of the stations, WLW with the Reds, KDKA with the Pirates, they start broadcasting baseball. And now the entire nation can share it. That's why Babe Ruth becomes the first great player in baseball history, the first really famous one. There were other great players. He was a horrible human being, but Ty Cobb was an excellent player. Walter Freight Train Johnson, hell of a pitcher. But Babe Ruth benefits from the exposure by radio. And so does baseball. By the way, here's Babe Ruth. By the way, another reason he became so popular, he had a larger-than-life personality. It was a good fit for radio and television. And he was known for his drinking, partying, and womanizing. His worst year in the 20s, he was recovering from venereal disease. But he was also an extremely generous, outgoing, and kind human being, and the American public loved him. And in my opinion, him and Hank Aaron are still the home run leaders. They didn't take steroids. Another sport that's going to benefit from radio is the new and floundering American Professional Football Conference, which eventually, within a year or two, changes its name to the National Football League. Consisted originally of only 11 towns, all of them in the Midwest and the Northeast. And by the way, one of the original teams was the Canton Bulldogs. That's why the Pro Football Hall of Fame is in Canton, Ohio. But the NFL benefits from radio as well. Football was already popular, but college football was the big sport, not the pros. Now, along with radio, the movies are going to have a profound effect as well. And to be honest with you, since I got about 2 minutes left, and this takes longer than 2 minutes, I'll see you guys